This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the award-winning weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for June 5th, 2018, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, mixed cuboids?
Cristina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi.
We have a great show for you today. Cristina is going to look into whether grapefruit juice can be lethal when mixed with drugs. And then Adam is going to explore whether the United States lost 1,500 migrant children. But first, we're going to take some listener mail, and I'm going to follow that with an Einstein rejection letter.
Yeah, following my coverage of vasectomies on episode 476 a couple months ago, we got a nice email from B that I wanted to share with everybody. Hello, everybody. I absolutely love your show and have no idea how I found it, but I've been so glad over the last 3 years that I did. Darren's take on altruism coincided with me searching how to use my charity dollars to most help what I wanted to see helped. So those discussions have been incredibly useful to me. Thank you very much, Darren. I couldn't help but think about responding to your most recent episode about getting a vasectomy. I'm a transgender woman who is in the minority in my community as a woman who enjoys her penis. We've been through a lot together, and while I understand the appeal of bottom surgeries, the risks don't equal the reward for me. As a result, it is possible, although very, very unlikely, that while having sex, I could impregnate my wife. While being in possession of a penis isn't something that triggers dysphoria for me, being referred to as the father of a child or having a spouse that is carrying my child is incredibly dysphoric. Birthing centers are not known for being very progressive when it comes to transgender people. My problems would be very small compared to the trans men who go through childbirth, but it still isn't something I feel I could handle. It brings up all the complicated emotions surrounding pregnancy and childbirth, especially all the gender roles that are assumed. Adoption, donor sperm, those things are fine. At least then I wouldn't have to be continually and exhaustively explaining to our medical providers the situation. Even though the chance of that happening is super tiny, I've considered getting a vasectomy. However, it's difficult because I would have to see somebody in the men's clinic area of my hospital, which is obviously somewhere I will stand out. The doctors that I've seen in these areas for other services, such as the possibility of saving sperm before starting hormones, had difficulty dealing with somebody who identified as a woman, but still had what they considered male parts. It's possible that I might be able to go to another clinic, but here in the US, our health insurance severely dictates what hospitals we can go to and still be covered. So my options seem to be save up all the money needed to pay for the procedure out of pocket, or go to a men's clinic and be outed while dealing with doctors who have difficulty using the correct pronoun. Neither of these are attractive options, so I haven't done anything yet, and just continue to hope that no pregnancy happens. And I completely understand the gendered language in the show as saying people or having to explain everything about the transgender experience over and over and over just for a short segment would not work. I just wanted to share my experience and that it's not always men who think about getting vasectomies, and it's not always women who take birth control pills. Just thought I might have an interesting take on vasectomies that you might not have thought of, and since you all seem like people who enjoy learning, wanted to share. Thank you very much for your show, and I look forward to the next one. B. So I really appreciated that take, and this was something I sort of briefly thought while preparing my segment, so I did sort of intentionally use sort of male-specific terms and pronouns and female-specific terms and pronouns just because we're talking about typically male vasectomies, and I was talking about typically female tube tyings just because I wanted the segment to be clear. But it was something I thought about, so it does get a little complicated, and it's always nice to have that other perspective because it's not everyone that goes through these things in the most standard way. That's why I think this email was important, and I wanted to share with everybody.
Thanks for the email, B.
Yes.
Yeah, and thanks for the nice words about the show.
Thanks so much. And now we turn to an email from Bob, who congrats us on our 500th episode and was writing about my gravitational anomalies segment. He thought he would share some of his experience. When he was a licensed scale and weighing machine tech working in Western Australia, well, there's actually an anomaly in the northwestern part of Australia. He said electronic scales, strain gauge types, etc., need to be configured for the working environment that shows a, quote, incorrect, quote, weight in the certification environment, the southwest of the state. There was a table of locations and offsets to work with. This is, of course, because they are measuring weight and not mass. Balance-type scales don't need adjustment, saying, hope that was of interest. So it is interesting, of course, to know that there are other gravitational anomalies that are known to the extent that there are tables that have to take this into account. Otherwise, people will do the wrong thing. And, of course, he highlights, when people are measuring gravity, people often substitute weight for mass, but they're not the same thing. So thanks, Bob.
Yeah, I really appreciated that email because it kind of made me realize that I don't understand how scales work. I understand how the basic old school scale of put things on one side, put things on another works. But, what happens inside my bathroom scale when I get on it, I don't really know. It's not always obvious. So that was an interesting way to think about it.
And the last letter in our mailbag segment is not actually about us, but about Einstein being rejected over a century ago. Last week, I was sent a message on Facebook that said, thought you might find this interesting, and no, I did not look into authentication, and it had an attachment. I was amused because at least the person knows me, and that one of the first things that will come to mind when I click on the attachment is to ask, is this true? I'm less amused that they couldn't do the 30 seconds of Googling before they sent it, but you have to meet people where they are. And we have a show for this reason. Anyway, the attachment was a supposed rejection letter that Einstein received from the University of Bern. Dated June 6, 1907. Dear Mr. Einstein, your application for the doctorate has not been successful at this time, and as such you are not eligible for the position of associate professor. While you pose an interesting theory in your article published in Annalen der Physik, we feel that your conclusion about the nature of light and the fundamental connection between space and time are somewhat radical. Overall, we find your assumption to be more artistic than actual physics. Sincerely yours, Professor Wilhelm Heinrich, Ph.D., Dean of Sciences. And there's a stamp and a signature. It looks like a dated old-timey letter that's actually been folded, and it does have University of Bern at the top. My first reaction was related to the date. 1907 was soon after Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, his miracle year, where he published 4 landmark papers in Annalen der Physik, scientific journal, in 1905, so it does reference that. 4 articles are about the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, special relativity, and mass energy equivalence. They changed how we understand time and space, mass and energy. His general relativity stuff wasn't about until a decade later. Maybe that should be a topic of a future segment. Anyway, but sometimes these things take time to ripple through a culture, so maybe that wasn't enough to get him what he was looking for. I also had minor uncertainties regarding how doctorates are awarded back then in Europe. It's like, well, nowadays you can't just write a paper and say, hey, university, give me a doctorate. That said, my first reaction should have been to the language. Why is this in English?
Yes.
Einstein was born in Germany and Bern is in Switzerland. Then I went to Snopes that indicated the letter is a modern fabrication and has various inaccuracies, but there is some truth to the matter.
What?
What? I know. Truth and falsehood. But then I also went to the history section of Stack Exchange. You can find these links in the show notes, trcpodcast.com.
Great website.
Where this rejection letter was being discussed, and happily found a link to the University of Bern itself refuting the letter. The following is from the university's website in an article by Martin Zimmermann, which used the work of the university archivist Nicholas Bütikofer. And here are some bullet points. At the indicated date, the Faculty of Philosophy and History and the Faculty of Philosophy and Natural Sciences had not been separated yet. Number 2, there has never been a dean, and not even a lecturer, named Wilhelm Heinrich at the University of Bern. Number 3, the language correspondence between Einstein, who was a German, native naturalized in 1901, and the university, if true, would have been in German and not English. Bütikofer suspects that the forger obviously cannot speak any German. I saw another comment that said it used the term as such, which didn't exist as a grammatical usage until the 30s, so that's also
that's
interesting.
neat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Number 4, the stamp next to the signature of Dean Heinrich has no relationship whatsoever with the University of Bern. It seems rather to be a coat of arms of Hungary. And number 5, the Seidelstrasse listed in the forged letter has only existed since 1931. Before this, it was called Sternwartstrasse, and today's postcode system also did not exist at the time. Well, that's a seemingly indictment of various inaccuracies, so it's a complete fake? Well, yes and no. Einstein did apply and was rejected from the University of Bern. On the 17th of June, 1907, Albert Einstein submitted his application for a habilitation in theoretical physics to the Director of Education of the Canton of Bern. Members of the faculty discussed and rejected it in the sitting of the 28th of October, 1907, because he hadn't submitted a habilitation thesis and not because his theories had been rejected.
Oh, boy.
In case you're wondering, habilitation in this context means you would be awarded the ability to having lectures and some sort of employment.
Okay.
Even then, Einstein enjoyed a strong reputation amongst his colleagues in the field, so it didn't take that much time to ripple through the culture how amazing he was. On the same day, Dean Gustav Tobler responded to Einstein that the faculty could only habilitate him once he submits the habilitation thesis at a later date. Einstein must have done this in the following months because on the 27th of February 1908, he was invited for a trial lecture at the University of Bern. Subsequently, the faculty, and a short time later the Directorate of the Bernese Education, granted him the teaching qualification. Also, those notes and correspondence were handwritten, not typed, by the way, in reality. There's photos online. Ta-da! The lesson here is that if you don't do your homework and fill out applications correctly, you too will be a loser like Einstein. And now to Cristina to explore whether if you take medication in the morning, can grapefruit juice be lethal to you?
Sounds a little sensationalist, doesn't it? The word lethal? We know it can be dangerous to mix medication with alcohol and that certain medications aren't as effective if ingested on an empty stomach or with certain liquids or with food. But when a friend mentioned the claim a few days ago suggesting grapefruit could be deadly, well, you know how it goes when you're on the reality check. How can grapefruit, which contains many nutrients like vitamin C and potassium that our bodies need to function properly, be deadly? Well, checkers, if you didn't know this before listening to this episode, please consider this a PSA because it is 100% true. Ingesting grapefruit while on certain meds can result in serious consequences, including sudden death. And the scary thing is not only are the number of these medications rapidly growing, but according to a study published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, doctors are often unaware of the severe side effects. And this is despite the fact that this grapefruit interaction with certain medications was actually discovered over 20 years ago originally.
Now, even though doctors aren't aware, I would hope that pharmacists usually catch this.
Right. Well, we'll get there, Adam. So the U.S. FDA published a consumer update last summer, and they require that certain prescription and over-the-counter drugs taken orally include warnings against eating grapefruit or drinking grapefruit juice while taking the prescribed drug. Now, something scientists have known for a while is that grapefruit juice can up the amount of drugs in your system. But more recent studies also show it has an opposite effect depending on the drug. Okay, so how does grapefruit actually interfere with the meds you're taking? Okay, simply put, grapefruit juice lets more of the drug you take into your bloodstream. So many drugs are metabolized because of an enzyme in our system, and grapefruits contain a group of chemicals called furanocoumarins, which inhibit the enzyme cytochrome P4503A4. Now, this enzyme is found in the lining of the gut and in the liver and is responsible for the inactivation of approximately half of all drugs. I found that quite surprising. So drinking grapefruit juice messes with your body's ability to metabolize potentially toxic compounds, allowing more of the drug into your bloodstream and even keeping it in your system longer. Now, drug companies account for the metabolization process. Obviously, they adjust doses accordingly. So this means your body can end up with too much of an active drug in your blood in short an overdose. The juice's effect varies in people because some people have more of the enzyme than others, but the bottom line is if you have too much of a drug in your blood, you experience side effects. David Bailey, a clinical pharmacologist at the Lawson Health Research Institute in London, and he's the guy who actually discovered the interaction between grapefruit and certain medications 20 years ago. He says that taking one tablet of some medications with a glass of grapefruit juice can be like taking 20 tablets.
Holy smokes.
That's scary. Bailey keeps close tabs on drugs with the potential to produce serious adverse reactions for the Canadian Pharmacists Association, and he's noticed a disturbing trend. Since 2008, the number of drugs with the potential to produce serious adverse reactions has jumped from 17 to more than 85. I'll give you guys a quick example. So statins are drugs used to lower cholesterol. Too much of this drug in your body increases your risk of liver damage, which can lead to kidney failure. But there is a long list of meds, including drugs used to treat cancer, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, prevent infections, some corticosteroids, things that treat things like Crohn's disease, and some antihistamines like Allegra, which contain fexofenadine. Now, fexofenadine is an example of a drug where grapefruit has the opposite effect. So instead of pumping too much drug into your blood, grapefruit affects proteins in your body known as drug transporters, which help cells absorb medication. So in this instance, as you said, less of the drug enters the blood, so the drug is just not going to work as effectively.
It depends how seriously you need that drug. Having a drug occasionally work a little less potently might not be the end of the world, depending on what you're taking it for.
Depends on the drug, I suppose, and your condition. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, of the 85 known drugs currently that interact with grapefruit, 43 could have potentially serious side effects, including sudden death, respiratory failure, acute kidney failure, and gastrointestinal bleeding. Now, the authors of the CMAJ study note citrus fruits such as Seville oranges, which are often used in marmalade, limes, and pomelos. They can also lead to drug interactions because they contain furanocoumarins. So how can you protect your grapefruit-loving self, friends, and family? Well, check with your doctor whenever any meds are prescribed to you. As I mentioned earlier, a concern is that some doctors may still be unaware of the increasing drugs and how severe the side effects. Read the info sheet that comes with your prescriptions because that'll definitely flag it. And just see if grapefruit juice interacts with anything. And for over-the-counter drugs, just please read labels. Make sure grapefruit isn't listed. There are warnings on labels for a reason.
Or just don't eat grapefruits or drink grapefruit juice because it's disgusting.
Yeah, anytime I eat a grapefruit, but I don't take any medication at all. But Pat always...
I actually do like grapefruit. If you find the sweeter ones, of course it's very sugary, but it might just be best to avoid it in general if you're taking any medication of any type. Thank you, Cristina. And now we turn to Adam. Adam, did the United States lose 1,500 migrant children?
Great question, Darren. A few things have been prominent in the news lately regarding migrants coming into the U.S. Heart-wrenching stories of children and parents being torn apart at the border are causing a great amount of sympathy, and reports that some 1,475 unaccompanied migrants have been lost by the U.S. is further cementing this tragedy to many. But the two events may not be as linked as some are making it seem, so I wanted to dive into the details just a bit. I don't usually cover this kind of topical news that doesn't have a particularly sciencey angle to it, and that's really more social and political, but in this case, there are some concrete facts that we can look at, and even though, due to the nature of the information, we can't really know all of the details of what's going on behind the scenes, I'll still attempt to get to the root of the story, and in this case, a little information can be deceiving, so I wanted to really clear that up. Now, I'd heard some conflicting details about what was going on with this, and so I wanted to dive in and see what was really going on, and thankfully, it seems that eventually even most of the mainstream media sources figured out what was going on, so if you really did try to pay attention, you could get the full story. Now, the backstory on this is something which has been reported somewhat broadly in the past few months. Children being separated from their families at the border, and that's the border entering the United States. This is a real thing that is happening in the United States of America. Now, one example which is getting a decent amount of press is the story of Miriam, who was separated from her 18-month-old son when crossing the border in Texas on February 20th. It's hard for me to read this. I have a 14-month-old child, so, it's very easy for me to picture this, and I just can't imagine that happening. The story, as she tells it, is that they were fleeing Honduras and were seeking protection from political violence there. Upon entering the U.S., she was ordered to place her son in the back of a government vehicle, after which he was driven away. 2 months and 11 days later, she was reunited with her son.
Oh, my gosh.
That's a lot of time for a child that young. So why would this happen? It seems, simply put, pretty terrible. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security said, as required by law, DHS must protect the best interests of minor children crossing our borders, and occasionally this results in separating children from an adult they are traveling with if we cannot ascertain the parental relationship or if we think the child is otherwise in danger. It's not clear how this applies to Miriam and her son, as she claims to have provided her Honduran ID card, her son's birth certificate, and his birth record from the hospital. In Miriam's case, a judge found that she had a credible asylum case, which is why she was reunited with her son a month after the ruling. So, a lot of delays going on there as well. After being separated from their parents, children are taken to shelters run by non-governmental organizations. There is an attempt to identify a relative or guardian in the U.S. who can care for the child. If no such person can be identified, the child can end up in custody indefinitely. Operators of these facilities have claimed that they are often unable to locate the children's parents because they don't have proper records. So is there ever potentially a legitimate reason for which separating a child from the adult arriving with them is a good idea? While it may seem that there's never such a time, there is the possibility of an adult arriving with a child who they fraudulently claim to be their child in order to gain quicker entry into the country. Migrants arriving at the border with children are historically granted quicker entry because of limitations on the amount of time a minor can be held in custody.
Also might have situations where someone's
Trying to kidnap a child.
kidnapping a child or bringing them in for
trafficking,
Nefarious
for anything like
purposes.
that.
yeah.
So we can imagine a worst-case scenario in which that makes sense. Now, is the alternative, in this case, a child being imprisoned with their parents, better or worse than separating the child from the parent? Well, one could probably make an argument one way or the other, but I think both alternatives seem a little terrible. But in the past, basically, they've been held together, but held for a very short amount of time because of restrictions on imprisoning the child. How common this kind of fraud isn't something I've been able to find specifics about, because the U.S. government is not very forthcoming with a lot of their data. Though the Trump administration has in the past stated that they intended to routinely separate immigrant adults from their children in order to deter them from entering, the Department of Homeland Security insists that this policy is not in place. Still, Trump has just last month announced that the U.S. would start a 100% prosecution policy at the border, which means that adults would be separated from their children who would be unable to be taken into federal custody as just sort of a default position. Now, this was originally suggested last year by John F. Kelly, who was the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security at the time. All said, the personal stories I've heard don't usually fit the narrative of the families being separated because of suspicion that the parents are fraudulently claiming the children to be theirs. As we see in Marion's story, there was never any doubt that the child in her custody was hers, and she ultimately did get the asylum she was asking for. The story of Silvana Bermudez has her being separated from her children 16, 11, and 3 after crossing the border in Arizona to escape MS-13 gang members who had threatened and shot at her and her family. She didn't see her children for 12 weeks. Again, her parental relationship was not in question, but rather she was being detained for having attempted to enter the U.S. illegally some 10 years earlier. So in this case, it's not separated to protect the children, but it's separated because she needs to be in prison. They can't imprison the children, and that seems to be what it's coming down to a lot lately. A woman from the Congo was separated from her 6-year-old daughter, who's now 7, after arriving in San Diego in November. She was also seeking asylum, and the mother's detention was not explained to her. The ACLU stated that a DNA test confirmed that the woman was the child's mother. They were finally reunited in March after a long time apart. Now, this is just a handful of examples. I can't speak to all the cases, but we can certainly say that at least in some of these cases, there are legitimately parents seeking asylum with their children. In these examples, the families are seeking asylum, and this is not illegal. So these are not illegal immigrants. If they're seeking asylum, that is a legal process. Without more data, we can't make definitive conclusions about the others. So then, what's this 1,500 number that's being thrown around? Are there really nearly 1,500 children who've been separated from their parents and subsequently got lost? In late 2017, Stephen Wagner, a Health and Human Services official, stated that when trying to follow up with some 7,000 children who'd been taken into custody while crossing the border, they were unable to reach nearly 1,500 of them, or more specifically, 1,475. This is the source of the claim that some 1,500 children have been, quote-unquote, lost. But this number doesn't actually have any bearing on the border separation cases. In these cases, they're unaccompanied minors who are either traveling on their own or with smugglers when they cross the border, often trying to be united with family members in the U.S. By the very fact that these are unaccompanied, these are not children who are crossing the border with their parents, and so there are no parents for them to be separated from at the border. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or ICE, a term you might have heard a bit, usually turns the children over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR. The ORR tries to place them with sponsors, meaning parents or other relatives to avoid having them linger in a federal facility. So they're trying to get to their family. If they do have family in the U.S., the ORR actually does make an attempt to put them with their family. That's actually pretty good. Now, this can end badly, such as a case where a child was trafficked to work on an egg farm, though some new checks have been put in place on sponsors to attempt to avoid this. I can't say how often this really happens, but the government is attempting not to have this happen. So, the ORR places these children with sponsors, and they aren't responsible for them anymore. They're no longer in the custody of the ORR, so when the ORR says that they lost them, it's not exactly like your parents losing you at the mall. In many, possibly most of these cases, the children's sponsors likely know exactly where they are. The ORR has a policy to call the phone number the sponsors submitted to the government 30 days after they were left. Of the 7,000 or so children, some 1,475 were not reached through that phone call. Now, why wouldn't someone be reachable through this phone call? There could be tons of reasons. Maybe someone changed their phone number. Maybe they don't like the government and very much didn't want to actually answer the phone. Perhaps the sponsor is undocumented and doesn't want government officials tracking them down. One can imagine many cases in which a family would not want immigration officials to track them down. So in this case, the government losing them might actually be in the child and the sponsor's best interest. That child is not lost from their family. Are some of these children being trafficked or having some other terrible things happen to them? It's certainly possible, but that's something the government tries to avoid, and we can't really correlate that to that number that's being thrown around. It is also worth noting that the 1,475 number of unreachable children is consistent with the kind of rates that occurred prior to the Trump administration, such as under Barack Obama. So much to say this whole 1475 business doesn't have anything to do with children being separated from their parents. In fact, the median age of unaccompanied minors is 16, so these are often adolescents crossing under their own initiative, rather than young children who are completely dependent on their parents. So just how many children are actually separated from their parents at the border? Data reviewed by the New York Times showed that over 700 children had been taken from adults claiming to be their parents since October. 100 of them were under the age of 4. These numbers seem a little high to me. This number was originally denied by the Department of Homeland Security. However, after 3 different federal officials confirmed them to the New York Times, a spokesman for the Department of Health and Human Services acknowledged that the numbers were approximately 700. So, let's set the record straight here. The 1,475 number we were throwing around earlier, it was way off. The actual number of children separated from their parents, about half of that alarming number. So, of course, there's a crucial difference being that those 700 weren't lost, but the number is still quite large. Many, like Miriam's son, may very well have been reunited with their families. However, without more data and transparency, we can't say for sure. A lot of these children may still be separated from their parents. Tyler Houston, press secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, stated, and I quote, "We ask that members of the public and media view advocacy groups claiming that we are separating women and children for reasons other than to protect the child with the level of skepticism they deserve." Well, I've attempted to look at this situation with a proper level of skepticism. I think it's fair to say that there are some pretty bad things happening to some families crossing the border into the U.S. While in the past these families would have been fast-tracked through the system and released into the country, there have been, since October, some 700 children, including 100 under the age of 4, who were forcibly separated from their parents. We don't have details on how these cases ended and how long these separations lasted. One thing we can say, however, is that the 1,475 missing migrant children aren't really missing in the way most people would use the term. Their sponsors may very well know where they are, even if the Office of Refugee Resettlement might not.
Great job, Adam.
Yeah, great deep dive on that.
That's exploring the truth behind the headlines for sure. So it's interesting for various reasons. That one is, if you start with 1,500, then you drop down to 700. Does that mean we should care half as much?
Right.
No. Scope and sensitivity hopefully works in the right way here. The other thought is that there are somewhat legitimate concerns on both sides where you don't want to separate children from their parents, of course, but you also, from the government's point of view, may want to make sure that the child is actually the child of the parent. And while those are always going to be in tension, one could imagine that just through technological developments the next, say, 10, 20 years, if you can do DNA tests in minutes, relatively without much invasion, then you could have that problem not solved, but at least dramatically shifted. Not because you could resolve the fundamental problem at the core, but just because technology is like, look, here you go. we don't have to balance these things as much as we did before because now we have more information.
And that's something the ACLU stated. There's a number of lawsuits that are going on here, and whether these practices are legal or not isn't something I can speak to, but people are questioning it, and that truth will come out one way or another. But basically the ACLU was saying, like, it's got to cost less to do a DNA test than to separate and house these people for months at a time. The angle of you want to protect the child from someone who's potentially not their parents, I understand, I appreciate, and I respect that, but it sounds like in a lot, if not most of these cases, that's not really what's going on, and there's a guilty till proven innocent approach to it that's being used on a system that probably worked a lot better when this wasn't happening all the time.
Great job, Adam. And before we close out the show, we just want to say thank you so much for all the listeners and their support in recognition of our winning the Mixcloud Award for Best Online Talk Show in the Science and Technology category. We're pretty excited about the whole thing. It's quite amazing. And to come on the heels of our 500th episode is even more delightful. So thank you to Mixcloud and the judges, and for listeners for all the support over the years.
I think that means Neil deGrasse Tyson has to come on the show.
I think it does.
Because we beat him out for this award. We always have time for you now, Neil. As for today's show, thanks for joining us once again. We did a little bit of a mailbag segment. We love getting your feedback, and we read it, and sometimes we'll read it on the air. And then I segue that into Einstein getting a rejection letter from Bern, which he actually got, but not the one that's publicized on the internet, because that's in the wrong language and has many other inaccuracies. And Cristina showed us that, yes, grapefruit and certain medication can be lethal, so be very, very cautious what you're taking, in both ways. Adam showed that the U.S. didn't quite lose 1,500 migrant children at all. The number is much less, and they didn't lose them, they just lost contact in a certain way. Thank you for that nuance, Adam. So until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smartassy.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
Which used the work of the university archivist, Niklaus. I said to myself, do it phonetically and type it out.
Yeah.
I think we just made the grapefruit industry crash.
Big grapefruit.
Big grapefruit.
This is bad news for our new grapefruit sponsor that we had.
Let's hope HelloFresh doesn't have any grapefruit-oriented things.
That's pretty funny.